it's basically part of a wider pattern in which, you know, the free space for reporting and for freedom of expression is being suppressed and on a consistent basis. The third example I wanted to give is France. Following the Charlie Hebdo attacks, a decree was adopted there that basically allows the Ministry of the Interior to order the taking offline of websites that have terrorist or pro-jihadist content within 24 hours. There's no prior control. It's basically the ministry issuing an order, and this needs to be complied with within 24 hours. You can then afterwards challenge it in court, but the procedures aren't super clear. And of course, again, this is a very lengthy thing, lengthy procedure, and the content will have been taken offline. The reason why this is problematic is because obviously the concept terrorist, pro-jihadist are very broad, they're not very well defined, and they're prone to abuse and to arbitrary application. Again, an example of suppression of speech online that falls within a wider context. The sad events that have taken place in France over the past couple of years just kind of have been leading to an environment in which free speech is being curtailed more and more, and it's really something to be very vigilant about. Now, also some positive examples. In April, the positive examples that are both linked to sad events, though. In April 2015, Walter Scott was shot by a police officer in the US. And I think that the very fact that all of us know about this is a great example of why social media and citizen journalism can be such a powerful tool. You will recall that Walter Scott, an African American, was stopped in a traffic stop, ran from the police officer, who basically stopped and fired shots several times in the back, took his taser, left it next to Walter Scott's body, and then phoned it in and said that Walter Scott had grabbed his taser and that he was basically shooting him in self-defense. There was a bystander there who had a camera phone, who shot all of this, and who published this on social media. I think that had that not been the case, none of us would have known about this, and this would have been just one of the many sad statistics that we see. I mean, there are hundreds of African Americans that get killed by police in the U.S. Every year. However, because someone was there, because the footage was shared, this led to protests, it led to inquiries, and it led to prosecutions. And I think that that is a really positive example of the power that that we as individuals can have in news reporting in that way. My second and last example also revolves around a tragic event, which is also in April 2015. It wasn't a good month. The Boston Marathon bombing. And I want to refer to this because Storyful showed itself to be a very powerful tool of communication at that point in time. What Storyful do is that they pull together information from social media and they edit it, they curate it to make sure that the stories that they share with their customers basically aren't the rumors that sometimes tend to kind of perpetuate themselves. So what they did, they created a setting up a Google Hangout. So people from different locations, they were pulling together geolocated tweets, photos, videos, etc., verified all the sources of information. And what they were able to do in the end actually was report on the story about 5 minutes or so quicker than any of the regular media who had people there on the ground, which I think is a very interesting thing to be aware of. But then of course also use social media to share their information. So things went out via Twitter, they created a playlist on YouTube with video footage, etc. So that is a good example of how you can be very productive by using social media. So the things that you read, Facebook, etc., to actually kind of create a reliable news story. And it will be very interesting to see where this is going to go. I mean, there are numbers of apps that are being developed that are out there at the moment that aid citizen journalism. You have Periscope that allows you to stream video, right, via Twitter. There's Meerkat. And then what I read recently also, what I thought was very interesting, there are also now apps that actually help citizen journalists create better news stories. So you can enter your data into an app, and it will, depending on the format of story that you choose, it will ask you questions as if you kind of had a virtual editor. So you can be a better judge as to what you might be missing in a story, what things you might want to double check before you basically send it out into the world. Now going back from slightly global scale to here in Nigeria, we have many more experts here in the room who are much better to speak to the issues than I am, and I really look forward to discussing what's on the table here in more detail over the next few days. But looking at threats and opportunities, I think that there's a similar pattern that can be detected here. Threats, the Cybercrimes Bill, and the Lawful Interception of Communications Regulation. I read both of them. I thought what was really interesting about the Cybercrimes Bill is that it actually contains a provision that is very much the same as the one that just got struck down by the Indian Supreme Court, the one about sending annoying messages. I think both bills are inspired by the UK Communications Acts of 2003, and I can only hope that eventually it will suffer the same fate as it did in the Indian Supreme Court. The Lawful Interception of Communications Regulation, which is quite a mouthful, I think was really disturbing when I read it. I see very overly broad grounds for the issuing of warrants to allow for interception on very vague terms, the commission of prevention or investigation of a crime, and I'm very much looking forward to someone explaining to me how the economic well-being of Nigerians could ever justify surveillance. And I also see serious due process issues in the sense that it's possible for the authorities to basically bypass any judicial check before instigating surveillance activities. So that is definitely something of grave concern. But there are also great opportunities, right? The Digital Rights Bill, which I think is a fabulous draft, is a very positive step to be made. I would like to say that you're the first, you're not, but you're one of the first for sure. Brazil adopted a similar bill in 2014, and there are a couple of countries that have followed suit. But I think it's a really wonderful initiative, and I think it sets a really good precedent, also particularly here in the continent. Rather than adopting cybercrime bills, etc., it would be really good if more countries were to look at positive internet legislation. So I hope you will be successful in getting the bill actually passed, and also that it will set a really good precedent for other countries, and not only here but worldwide, to be quite honest. So I look forward to discussing all of these topics in the next couple of days. I'm very happy to take questions. I'm also very happy to take questions during the tea break or whatever, whichever you prefer.
If you have any questions for her now, we'll take some right now while everything is fresh in everybody's mind. Some of the issues that she's raised, Tanzania's the cyber crimes bill act that is now a law that's being challenged. So some of the issues that have come up in her presentation, we'll also be taking questions about them now. Is there anybody who has a question, please, or a contribution to the conversation?
Hi, my name is Renata Avila, and I work for the Web Foundation. My question is very simple because we have seen very, very bad legislation coming up from Europe and from the US. And what should be the strategy for Africa to resist, to avoid that their legislators fall into the temptation of copying those bad laws, because it's like a virus, it's a bad effect that if for example, if the UK passes this horrible bill that they are about to pass on intelligence powers, highly likely many other countries will follow. So what will be your advice on that line?
That's a very good question, and it's also one that kind of connects with a broader theme, in the sense that we've seen on various fronts bad legislation being copied from the US and the UK, for example, particularly on anti-terrorism. Ethiopia, for example, more or less copy-pasted the US and UK bills, just taking out any safeguards that actually were in there, unfortunately. But also, those aren't great pieces of legislation, and those aren't examples to be followed, right? I think that the attitude there should be is that you can do better than what is being done in the UK and in the US. And I think that there's definitely large potential here in challenging, first of all, the idea of adopting such similar legislation. But I also think that the courts are also capable of recognizing that. We had some very nice success at the African Court on Human and People's Rights, on freedom of expression, not too long ago, in which we also basically showed the court that this is what the European and the Inter-American courts are doing at the moment. You can be even more progressive. And actually, we almost got there. We almost got the court to say that criminal defamation as such was in violation of the right to free speech, which is something that actually we never got that far, right, with the other regional courts. So there is potential there. And I think a combination of both questioning the idea of basically copy-pasting what I think is bad legislation and saying we can do better, challenging legislation that is being adopted to make sure that otherwise the courts put a check to it. But I think one of the things that I really liked about the Digital Rights Bill is also the approach of kind of having a positive counter sound, right? And I think all of those things in tandem could hopefully lead to a better outcome than we are currently seeing in Europe.
All right, is there anyone else with a question?
Had some success with, court cases with government, particularly with reference to, the African states that you work for. There are many people in the room who work, in country or across countries. And my question is, what would you suggest? I mean, I don't know if it's super popular within this country, but what would you suggest for advocates that have to see government in terms of what are the things you need to look out for that needs to within the country?
It's a really good question, and it's $1 million question in a way, because you can never really predict what will tilt the balance, right? But I do think that there are certain things that you can always do, and that's look at how good results were obtained somewhere else. The way that I always look at it is that, probably a lot of judges, a lot of courts would like to be progressive. They're just not always comfortable being the first. So one of the things that I think is always very compelling is showing how their colleagues elsewhere have come to the same decision, the same progressive decision that you want them to take. You give them a level of comfort in that way that, they're not completely out on the limb. There are very few judges who are comfortable with that. So what you do is you try to collect positive precedent from as many similar or jurisdictions as you can, or jurisdictions that you know that they have respect for and that they appreciate, and try to kind of present that and say, like, look, this is the status quo, these are the people that you should be looking at. You can do the same or potentially even better. And I think that can be a very persuasive way of approaching the matter.
Are there more questions for her? All right.
Thanks, Nani, for your presentation. My name is John. I think I have to stand. Okay. Rights are rights, offline and online. And I noticed that offline, there are certain regulations that actually protect these rights, the ones we have online. We have those kind of regulations online, sorry, I mean like the ones we have offline. And then sovereignty, for instance, if I'm in trouble in a country that is not mine, I could run into my embassy and I'll be protected. That kind of sovereignty and the protection that comes with it, do we have it online? I'm asking because I'm wondering if I host content on a server in my room, why should somebody in the US have a problem with it, and why should somebody in UK be able to take it down?
Another million-dollar question to which I don't have the answer, and I don't think any of us have the answer right now. It's one of the fundamental issues to grapple with, exactly because of the complete cross-boundary nature of the internet. Yeah, and I'm afraid I can't give you a very succinct answer to that. We can definitely talk about that a little bit more at length later.
Are there more questions for her at this time? All right, I have a question. You had made mention of the issue, but you made mention briefly of journalists and how you now see the ordinary citizen as the citizen journalist, and of course in the Walter Scott's example. How can media house to work with quote-unquote citizen journalists while still continuing to keep to the ethics of the profession, and in somehow also not necessarily censor, but be very careful with what the citizens are bringing to them as news and updates and stories? We see with the Arab uprising, those are things that happened with ordinary citizens on the street. So where do the media houses and the real journalists come into this?
That's a really good question. I think that really depends on should be judged on a case-by-case basis. I think to a large extent it depends on basically who has the content first, right? If the content comes from a citizen journalist or an accidental journalist, as I called them at some point in a blog post, somebody just happens to be at the right place at the right time, happens to have a camera phone, are they a journalist? Yeah, that's a really big question. I did argue at the time, though, that I thought that they would merit the same protection as journalists do, in the sense that if they are sharing information that's in the public interest, they should have the same rights and guarantees, basically, as professional journalists. I think because of the fact that the business models of media houses are changing so much, this is something that will crystallize itself over the next years. You see that more and more outlets are working with freelancers already, which is also something that's slightly different, which, by the way, unfortunately, quite often leaves the freelancers rather unprotected. But I think that the moment that a media house decides to republish the content, they take responsibility for verification as well, right? So I don't quite see a huge difference there from content being brought to them by someone who carries a press badge necessarily. I do think that we'll probably see some norms develop in the sense that when we're looking at online sharing, social media sharing of content really quickly and more or less live, that there will be more issues there. But I think this is something that will kind of naturally sort itself out.
So, is there anything else? All right, please let's put our hands together for Nani this morning. Thank you very much for that. Please also don't forget she's offered her time and attention if you have a question that comes up by